Hello, welcome to the AP Environmental Science Chapter 6 lecture. So let us begin. This chapter is titled Ethics, Economics, and Sustainable Development. We are going to get into a lot of the history of environmental science and terminology that you're going to see on the AP test. So let's begin. Your chapter begins by defining culture and worldviews. Why? Well, we need to understand people's culture and worldview in order to get a grasp on what people desire and what they want. Their worldview determines a lot of the way they make decisions, and people's culture affects a lot of the way decision making takes place. So when we're talking about the environment, it comes down to decision making and making decisions that are beneficial to everybody and the environment. So culture and worldview are huge things that impact that. Ethics, well, that's a set of morals that people have and principles that they live by. So environmental ethics deals with, what values do people put on the environment. So, you're setting a criteria, and from that, you're kind of developing a thought process that goes along with it. So this is all about setting morals, principles, and values based on, in this case, environmental ethics. We're talking about the environment and how we can help preserve it and conserve it. There's this thing called the golden rule. All right. If you ever heard about the golden rule, that treat others as you would like to be treated, basically. Real simple thing. So we need to think about the environment as a place that we need to treat with respect so that it gives us back things that we can use from it. All right. Also, the principle of utility is a huge factor that comes into environmental science. Why? Well, the whole idea is to use something in a way, right, so that it produces the greatest amount of benefits for the most people. This is kind of like why we vote. We vote because the winner gets the most votes. In turn, the whole goal and the idea of a voting process is to have the winner benefit the most people. That's why voting takes place. So the principle of utility tries to take that into play. Now, basically, we got to think of instrumental value or intrinsic value, all right? There's this thing called extrinsic value. So let's talk about extrinsic value so you can understand what intrinsic value means also. Extrinsic value would mean something has value like, for example, you do something because you're getting paid to do it. Okay. The opposite of that, or for example, you're not getting punished, so you do it. That's extrinsic value. Intrinsic value, something with intrinsic value, is you're doing it because it gives you self-satisfaction. So the whole idea of learning, as a teacher, we want students to think of learning as something that's intrinsic, but most students think of it as something extrinsic related to a grade. Teachers want it to be intrinsic because then you're learning for the sake of learning, all right? Basically, when we think of instrumental value, we got to think of a forest. That's a great example. Well, why a forest? Well, does the lumber have a monetary value? Yeah, and that would be instrumental value that we look into it. Okay, a forest also has intrinsic value. Okay, organisms live there. They make it their home. It's their habitat. So they need it just for their self-worth, basically. All right. So these are two terms, instrumental and extrinsic value, that are used commonly in environmental science. We don't want things to be extrinsic. All right. We want them to have intrinsic value along with some instrumental value. Okay. Industrial Revolution, we've talked about this many times throughout this course. What did that do? It changed the environment. Okay. Machines began replacing humans in the labor. All right. People moved to cities. Cities started getting busier. Why? There was jobs there. This created a population boom. More population, more people, more pollution. All right. During this time, there was a movement called transcendentalism. All right. And what was it about? It was about kind of going back to nature. So this movement was kind of one of the early environmental movements that existed. So this chapter is going to focus on some of the history. John Muir, if you ever hear his name, he is the founder of the Sierra Club. What is the Sierra Club? They're an environmental movement. If you ever see Sierra Club, you're talking about a group that is definitely involved in preserving the environment. And John Muir was one of the people that believed in the preservation ethic. He was an ecocentric, meaning nature has a lot of value. Okay. Anthropocentrics, he was also that. And he believed that dealing with humans, that means human happiness, was also part of this preservation. People like to go camping. People like to use the wilderness. People don't want to see it polluted. People don't want to see it dirty. They want to go out there and breathe fresh air. So Today, people still utilize these resources. Gifford Pinchot, founder of the U.S. Forest Service. This is some more history. He believed in conserving. Okay. He wanted to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the longest time. All right. Now, they were all about making sure conserving and preserving. All right. They opposed what's called the developmental ethic. The development ethic was, hey, just grow economically, money, 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 money. And what they realize is, no, that's not good for the environment. It's counterintuitive to the environment. Aldo Leopold, he was a forest manager. He was involved in early movements in environmental policy. Okay, so what did he do? He argued that people want to preserve integrity, stability, beauty of the body. He was all about the environment. So these are some early people who helped inspire things. He believed it was called the land ethic, and these are some of the early environmentalists involved in the studies. Environmental justice. Now, environmental justice is an interesting situation because what happens is there really isn't true environmental justice for lower socioeconomic people. They're not represented the same way as people who are wealthier are. So what happens is environmental justice it's applying a standard environmental policy and practice to all people, but in reality, this is not true. Environmental justice does not really take place. Poorer people are exposed to more pollution. Recently, in the United States, we had a major problem with water in the state of Michigan, and the communities that were affected by it just happened to be the poorest communities in the state of Michigan. Go figure. It didn't happen in a nice neighborhood. It happened in a poorer neighborhood. When they build a dump site of some sorts, they don't generally build it near a very wealthy community. So environmental justice relates to that. Here's some examples. A toxic waste dump was built in the highest proportion of an area where African Americans resided. Go figure, huh? Where the people have the least amount of money. They put uranium mines on Navajo lands, and then the Navajo Indians helped. Actually, a lot of them were miners. A lot of them developed lung cancer as a result. So there just was no justice. They were poorer, so they weren't treated the same way. These types of problems still continue today. In farming areas, there's a lot of fertilizer, a lot of chemical pesticides, a lot of chemicals are being used. And you have a lot of Latino farm workers that are exposed to that. Coal miners in Appalachian states, they're exposed to a lot of pollutants, and then you and I take advantage of what they're doing. In African American communities, those areas are more susceptible to flooding. Go figure. They built homes in areas that are more susceptible to flooding in lower socioeconomic areas. So it's just environmental justice the whole idea is to have equality, but in reality, there isn't equality. We have to talk about economics when we're talking about environmental science, specifically because everything's dictated by the flow of money. Right? So economics studies how goods and services, not two things. Goods would be a material commodity, and services is people are paying you for a service that you're doing for them. Now, an economy relies on these goods and services. All right, to produce a lot of these goods and services, natural resources are used, and this is where the ecosystem services come into play. This is where ecological services come into play. So the environment supplies a lot of the services that we need in an economy. They go hand in hand. But most people who are all about the economy are all about producing more and more money. It's all about a numbers game and money, money, money. When you do that, you're destroying the environment, which helps produce a lot of those goods that you need. Neoclassical economics relies on the process of what we call supply and demand. Right now in the United States, currently, this is 2021, we have a supply shortage for things. And then we have a high demand with a supply shortage. So what does that do? Pricing is high on certain commodities. For example, cars right now. There was a shortage in chips for a specific production process. In the production process, computer chips that they needed. So the supply dropped, demand was still high, the cost went up. Okay, so demand is high, supply is low, price is very high. And that's what's happening right now. This is typical neoclassical economics. A cost-benefit analysis. You look at something and how is it going to benefit you? How much it costs versus what you get out of it. I always tell my students education is one of those things. If you go to a fancy university and you get a degree in something and you spend all this money on it, but you can't get a job, your cost-benefit analysis was not done well. If you're going to go to a fancy school, you need to get a degree in something that helps pay off some of what that degree cost. External costs, this comes up in several chapters. These are things that happen, and the buyer and the seller, but these are things that happen in an area generally. For example, if you go extract resources from an area, you're going to pollute a particular environment. People live in that environment. They're going to deal with the health effects of the pollution. Where you and me are buying a TV set that they produced as a result of that. So the mining got the materials to make my TV. Some people are paying the price in pollution. All right. So external costs, cost of transaction that affects others besides the buyer. So you and me, we're not affected by it, but someone else living somewhere else is affected by it. Okay. Going back to neoclassical economics, neoclassical economics are all about just production and supply and demand. And what they don't really deal with is that that resources are exhaustible. Okay, so we got to look into all of those things and for the real value of something. So a lot of times there's a disconnect from the environment and economics when the environment is necessary for a healthy economy, basically. Discounting. This is called short-term thinking. What you do is, for example, let's go extract something right now. We need the material to produce all these computer chips we're talking about. But in the end, we're going to pollute an area and destroy it for the next, say, 20 some odd years. Okay. So effects in the future are not granted the same as they should, even though we should be looking at the future. So discounting is where future effects are granted less effect than the ones in the present. So it's all about short-term, short-minded thinking. And that's generally what happens from an economic standpoint. Non-market values, these are things that we don't really have a true cost or value for, but they create value. A lot of them are how something looks, and when you pollute it, it doesn't look very good anymore. When you destroy habitat and you kill organisms, it doesn't have much value anymore. So non-market values are the values of things that we have as a result of conserving or preserving. For example, look at this, the use value, something we use. Extrinsic value, all right? This is knowing that these guys exist. They don't go extinct. Option value, something we want to use later. Aesthetic value, how something looks, how beautiful it is. Educational value, scientific value, cultural value. So we actually have a value we have put on things. Contingent valuation is where you go put forth surveys and ask people how much it would cost or how much a particular ecosystem may have for them. Okay, so you would say to the people in the area, what is the value of the service that you see, and then they rank that value on the actual value the service will provide, and then you can make decisions based off of that. All right. So, for example, the households valued preservation at 80 to 143 million when the mine would have created 102 million in economic benefits. This 80 to 143 is very similar to that 102. So, why go destroy it for 100 million when preserved it's worth about 100 million? GDP, you hear this term commonly. This is the total monetary value of goods and services. Generally, it's given you as a per capita, which means per person in the United States. And the United States, the per person, the GDP, the total is in the trillions. But per person, it's about, the United States for 2020 was about $65,000 a person in value. So each person in the United States, according to what we produce in goods and services, has about $65,000 in value, so to speak, per person, is what the U.S. is currently. Now, that's not fair because not everybody actually makes that much money, or some people make much less, some people make much more, so it doesn't account. But on average, the average person, about $65,000 a person in goods and services per year. That's the GDP. It usually measures how wealthy a country is. Ecolabeling has to do with basically, for example, its common one is used in tuna. A lot of times you'll see tuna labeled as dolphin safe. That means they are catching the tuna in a way where they don't have extra catch in the form of dolphins dying as a result of it. So you'll see you'll see coffee labeled a certain way, timber labeled a certain way, and that means they're getting it from a sustainable fish. There's sustainable fisheries that are used nowadays. So everything when it comes from an area, it could be eco-labeled, and you should buy products that are probably eco-labeled because they're generally better for the environment. Now, there's some gimmicks out there. Beware of that. Greenwashing. Basically, this is where corporations make something sound environmentally good when in reality it is not. Okay. So they'll tell you how great water bottle comes. They'll tell you how great their water is, how good it is for you, when most of it just comes from the ground or from a tap, actually. So they'll say it's a mountain spring or something like that. And so greenwashing is where corporations make something sound great and how great it is for the environment. In reality, it has little or no impact on the environment. And we'll stop there for chapter 5.